It's page 7 in the consumable section, and pop out today's important moments.
Consumable.
Ah,
No, they're the same form. There's just one for each of the 4 days of the course.
you're right.
Yeah. So if you didn't, yeah, absolutely, they're for you.
Okay.
So if you didn't use the back, you can certainly use the back of the first one. If you wrote on the back of the first one, there is a clean copy for each of the 4 days of the course.
Sounds like they're blowing the hallway.
Yeah. So to get us started for today, I wanted to share a few of the things that were coming up in the important moments. So there are no names attached to these, but if it is your comment, you are welcome to add to it. But I just wanted to share some of the themes and some of the things that were being brought out. So this was on a number of them. Use sentence starters to help students talk about the habits or to talk with each other. So thinking about how might you set up sentence stems or sentence frames to help kids talk in the way that you want them to talk. And again, if there's something that pops up here and you're thinking, oh, that's a great idea, make sure that you write it down on your important moments from today. The habits are in every lesson. Words can be included in learning target or the success criteria. Students talking is important, but what they talk about matters. And that came out of a quote from yesterday, and somebody had recorded it on their important moments. And then it showed up in variations of that in a few other places. Using mistakes, stack points, and analyzing errors for learning. That showed up in multiple places in different ways, but that theme came through in multiple places. Math needs to be engaging to help kids think hard and persevere. So thinking about how do we make this engaging, how do we make it relevant to them so that it's something that they're interested in jumping into. And then make sense, justify, and generalize are the key. So again, thinking about our habits of mind that we've got up on the wall. And a little different arrangement today, so I'm going to ask some of you to kind of be swiveling around, whether you're looking towards the screen or looking behind you. But again, that make sense, justify, generalize is what we're really about for the mathematics. The other habits of mind, the habits of interaction, are helping kids do those things. Anything that you'd like to add to that list of things that you thought were real key pieces for you from yesterday?
Yeah.
Those are kind of the trends that I was seeing as I read through. So I do want to say thank you for allowing me to take them home and read through them. It does help me really think about what you're thinking about, to take a look at your notes. Much like you might do an exit task with your kids in class, and then take it home and think about how are they thinking about the pieces that we talked about today. So on that note, I want us to jump back in with a little bit about teacher reflection. So if you would turn to page 31 in your notebook. I'm going to ask you to take just a couple minutes here to read page 31 about teacher reflection, and either underline, highlight, star, circle, whatever your method for interacting with the text is. Some of the ideas that are jumping out at you as you read those 3 paragraphs. 2 things that jumped out at you from the page. And we're gonna start here and say partners. You guys are the partners around the corner. And then the 3 of you would be a trio. And before you start, I'm gonna ask the person who's sitting closest to the door going into those offices to start. Share 2 things that jumped out at you as you were reading. When you're done, your other partner that's sitting closest to the exit door, and then go ahead and share their 2 items, and then think about whether you come up with the same things or whether there's something else that you wanted to mention, but it wasn't within your 2 items you got to talk about up front. Questions? Okay. Person closest to the offices, go ahead and start.
Just kidding. It's like,
Are these brothers? Or have an actual scenario tunnels? No, my sub is like a 30-year-old.
the first thing.
teacher in
Oh, really?
Stephen Claus. That's good. Talking covers. That's good.
It's just a day. Yeah.
He wanted to teach like the whole book. I was like,
What was his name?
Lyle Packer.
What do I need to do? How am I doing? How old am I?
Yeah.
Well, it's just nice to actually have that.
Conversation's over,
For me, getting students to think about how they're
Same
learning.
thing.
I need to feel that anymore before tests.
And I also,
Maybe have
is
them
that, and I also
Can you
really
say it so that everybody can hear you and then she
I didn't
can
know
share?
that you were in our group.
We can start started. You're right. Go ahead. I was sorry.
Yeah, having students think about how they're learning. I hardly do that with like an actual sheet. That's what my goal is for the year. And I'm gonna start doing that for my classes. Reflect on how they develop tests.
That's just like a reflection.
the laser kills them.
I was thinking of building
How are
a
you
study
doing? How am I
guide.
doing?
Do the study guide, just kind of very prepared for the test. Something happened.
We gotta do we can teach kids
So
to
I'm
do
thinking
that.
of trying that.
That's the goal.
Rebecca and I have for each chapter, ahead of time, we write out the learning target for each section of the chapter. And then there's a reading there, so like after they do homework quiz, they can go in and evaluate kind of as we're learning through the chapter, how they're doing on each section. And then before the test, they use that to look back and say, okay, which parts of the chapter did I not do very well on, focus, or their study guide, and focus in specific areas. I don't know how well they are at self-evaluation, you know, I feel like some kids, great, and then like, you know, they don't pass the quiz.
But I said, kind of,
You know, so they're really in
like I ended
the
up
grade.
Figure out.
Yeah,
I
right.
had a laser dart, so.
What proficient looks like.
It's definitely hard for anything. No matter what age you are, it's self-assessed.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Right, I'm gonna bring us back together. So let's get just a couple ideas out around things that were important to you or were jumping out at you as you were thinking about teacher reflection. Ian, would you share something that you and your group talked about?
I didn't really talk too much about teacher reflection, but I guess just making notes after a lesson to see how it went, so that you can reference that for the next year when you teach it. It's something that I haven't done a lot of. I've just kind of gone by memory, but it would be a good idea to make a note or change it. Like if you make a mistake on your assignment, change it right away. Change it right away in your lesson so you don't repeat that mistake the next time, which I think.
So thinking about a lesson after you've taught it.
Yeah.
What worked well, what would you do different next time, and then making some notes.
Yeah.
So Matt, when I walked by you and Dan, I heard you guys talking about a chunk of the text about how you might respond to it. Do you want to share that piece, or do you remember that?
Well, it's not just doing the reflection.
Okay.
I mean, because you can reflect on it, but if you don't change what you're doing, then it's not a process. So part of the process is after the reflection, you have to then change what you're doing, come up with alternatives and stuff like that.
Yep. Absolutely. Other thoughts on teacher reflection?
Well, the main thing that we highlighted was actually about student reflection.
Okay, say a little bit about that.
student reflection, that often in our resource classes, the students don't reflect on what they're doing. It's just more, they'll spit something out, and if it's the right thing, then they're happy and they do it. If it's wrong, it's well, it's not done.
So thinking really hard, how do we support students in being reflective or metacognitive?
That, yes.
Yep. So that's one of our habits up there. Habits of mind is reflection and metacognition, and thinking really hard about how do we support students in doing that. And it could be in small ways. Well, how do you know you're right? So that they're reflecting on the answer that they just provided and how they know that it's correct. It could be asking them to reflect on what did you used to think, but now what do you understand? I've heard that sentence before. I used to think blank, but now I know blank because blank. You could use a sentence starter like that to help them along.
I definitely think it's beneficial in our PLCs, like when you, and it's kind of harder because our schools are getting smaller, so like Dan and I last year when we taught 6th grade together, to definitely be able to talk and communicate about that, and meeting with the other teacher at EMS that teach the same class, I think it's beneficial. I don't know that we've mastered or even done a very good job of talking with people that don't teach the same grade level as us, and getting a lot out of that.
Those conversations can be pretty much invaluable.
Yeah.
Especially if you have the opportunity to plan together, and then you can think about the lesson afterwards together. So how did that work? What did your students understand? What did you do to support that? And if you're getting something and another teacher isn't, sharing those strategies, sharing those ideas, will be really important. And again, I'm going to go back to what Matt and Dan were talking about, that that part of the reflection process is not just thinking about the teaching or thinking about the student learning, but then responding to it in some way. If my students got what I was after for the day, and so my reflection is, okay, what I did there really supported students, it might be, well, what else could I do? If they didn't understand, then it might be a bigger thing, how might I need to change what I was working on, and what am I going to do tomorrow to help make sure that understanding is there. So with that in mind, I wanted to give us a chance to do a little bit of reflection together. So if you turn the page over to 32. Page 32 has 4 bullets at the top that talk about what research says about effective classrooms. And I have them up here on a poster as well. These are some of the big ideas that we pulled out. And yesterday they came off of page 8 and 9 and 10, where we were looking at some of the research related to mathematics classrooms. So we're going to think in some depth today about how mathematical sense making, reasoning, and understanding is part of that classroom. And I also want us to talk about mathematically productive teaching. The mathematical culture of effort and growth really comes out in our day 3. And the worthwhile mathematical task really comes out in day 4. So we're going to touch on those today, and I'll share a resource with you. But we might spend more time on the first and the fourth, and then come back to the second and third when we get back together in January. With that said, I'm going to have you look over at page 33, and there are questions about each of those 4 sections, kind of overarching questions that you might ask yourself. And I'm going to ask you to take a look at the question at the top about mathematical sense making, reasoning, and understanding. And the question specifically says, did the activity center on mathematical sense-making, reasoning, and understanding by all students? What is your learner-based evidence? And for the purposes of a quick conversation, I want you to put yourself in the position of a student or a learner and think back to our basic operations work that we did yesterday around subtraction and then division. As if you were the learner and that was some mathematics that we were working on together. And in just a moment, I'm going to have you check in with your partner or partners, since we have a trio, and think together, is there some evidence that that activity was based on or centered around mathematical sense-making, reasoning, and understanding? You might think about it first, and then have you check in with your partner in a moment. Turn and check in with the same partners that you were talking with just a moment ago, and just think about, was there some evidence that yesterday's activity for us was centered around sense-making, reasoning, and understanding?
Just to be clear, are you
Absolutely.
talking about when we were talking about the subtraction and the
Yes.
division?
Yep, when we're talking about subtraction with whole numbers, and then division with whole numbers, and then moved into division of a whole number divided by a unit fraction. And put yourself in the role, of a student. And that was an activity that we were doing together. And is there some evidence that that activity was centered around sense-making, reasoning, and understanding? Does that make sense? Okay, great. I'll let you check in with your partner and think about whether there's some evidence of that.
You wrote stuff down.
Yes, you're trying to make sense of it, of course. Yes. You're reasoning through
You're
it.
using multiple different models to
Yes.
remember your numbers.
Reasoning. Was there understanding? Yes. For the most part.
Understand?
Yes. Yeah. Building understanding. Yeah.
By all students.
Yes.
What he usually does is he'll sit down and say, what are long-term goals? Just,
Oh, that's
Yes.
gonna be favorite. Yeah, a little bit. And it's, and I can feel, and I think, because it's never gonna go right here. I can tell there's something to it. And it's like radiating down my arm. It's trying to get away from
It doesn't flow very well.
He's probably gonna be like, I've never done that.
That's right. I'm gonna pull us back together.
That would be a hypochondriac.
Let's just get a few ideas out before we do something with a reflection tool. Dan, would you be willing to get us started? What is something that you and Matt were talking about?
We said, as far as a learner individually, where there's sense-making situations happening for me and for Matt, the model, reasoning, the explanations and the group activities, we were all discussing, whether it was in our small group or as a whole group. That's when we tried to understand and tear apart the expressions and see if they made sense. And then understanding the whole group. That made sense that took place, but what we kind of walked away with too is that, for each kid, would they really walk away with an understanding of that situation at a deep or a full level? And we kind of disagreed that wouldn't probably take place. Even though everyone experienced maybe those things, maybe they wouldn't all walk away with a full understanding like we want them to.
So, yeah.
Based on different reasons.
So I'm going to try to break down a few, because there was a number of ideas in there. So first, is you were asked to create some models. So you had an opportunity to work with the tiles and to create a model and to think about how that might represent that particular equation that you were given. Some people had one model, some people had more than one, depending on what meanings of the operation they were thinking about. So that was one piece that you had called out. You had also mentioned when we did things, well, let me make sure I do it in the order that you just said. You mentioned working with your partners so that you were making sense of what somebody else had done. So it gave you an opportunity to dig into potentially another way of thinking about your same model, or to dig into somebody else's model and make sense of that. And then we came together, a whole group, and we did some public processing. So these came down last night because there was a board meeting. So they're kind of stacked. So if we want to look for one, I'd be happy to pull out whichever one we're interested in. But we had a chance to do some work together, whole group, in publicly processing some of those ideas. A couple different meanings of subtraction, a couple different meanings of multiplication, of division, revisited those meanings of division when we got to the whole number divided by a fraction. So different ways of providing opportunities for people to make sense of something, reason about it, dig into an understanding. But the question was, did everybody have that understanding? So how would you find that out? Or how do you think, I was trying to think about that yesterday, and then how might you find that out in your classroom?
I don't think you get an exit slip, or you give a quiz, or you have an exam problem, or a street problem.
So you could do any number of those things in your classroom. You could give the kids a problem to work on, you could give an exit ticket, it might be a short quiz, but in some way you're going to want to assess what they understand. How else might you gather some data?
Talking to them, sitting down with them, talking to them.
Sure, absolutely. You could check in with them, you could do some conferring with them. So yesterday, the two methods that I was using most of the time was to listen to your discourse. So I was walking by, I wasn't just checking to make sure people were doing something, I was peeking over shoulders, looking at what was being written down, listening to the conversations you were having with your partner, whether I said anything or not. So I was, thinking about, so how are these different adults making sense of this? What ideas are coming out? And then also thinking about the conferring that I did. So I dropped in with different groups, and I had a couple of purposes for that. One was to really be curious about, some thinking or some ideas that were out there, but also to help me think about what order I wanted to bring out those ideas in terms of selecting and sequencing, so we're kind of telling a story and hitting on the different meanings. Yeah, absolutely. Other ideas? Seth, I eavesdropped on you and Steve talking. Would you want to add to the conversation?
Well, we said yes to everything. Mathematical sense making. I mean, we obviously had to make sense of the problem before we could dive into the problem. Reasoning, then it's kind of, it seems like you had to reason through the problem, and then I think we had understanding at the end. I think there was evidence of understanding, yes.
Yeah, and I did do an exit ticket, but
Right.
that wasn't my purpose in terms of our group being together. It was to have that experience so that we were thinking about it together with both our mathematician cap on as well as our teacher cap on. Other thoughts before I have you look at a specific reflection tool? Okay, so if you would turn the page over to 35. There's a teacher reflection tool there, and it's entitled Mathematical Sense Making, Reasoning, and Understanding. And there are 4 of these teacher reflection tools, and I'll introduce you to all 4 of them today. We're going to spend some time on the first one and the last one, and the other 2 will come out in a little more depth when we get together in January. But I just want you to know that they're there. For this particular piece, there are 8 questions that you might ask yourself as you're reflecting on a lesson and whether it included mathematical sense making, reasoning, and understanding. So the hope is that we're saying yes to many of these, if not all of these, and when we reflect back on a lesson. I'll be transparent that if I'm going to use a tool to reflect, I like to use that tool when I'm planning. So even though this is titled Teacher Reflection Tool, if you were to do, if I was to be your colleague, I would be using these as part of my planning tools as well, and trying to think ahead of time. If I go do what I've just planned, are my kids going to be able to make sense, justify, and generalize about the mathematics? Are they making sense, reasoning, and understanding? To really dig into one of these tools, we're going to do a quick activity, and I'm going to ask you to think about what some of these items are not as a way to make sense of what they are. For example, if you come down to the third one, it says create and reason, try that one more time. Create and reason from mathematical representations as tools for reasoning about solving problems and for developing conjectures, justification, and generalizations. That is, do they use their representations, visual, verbal, numeric, algebraic, graphical, and everyday life, to model relationships and generate ideas and solutions, or is use of such tools algorithmic, only to show results, and or limited to teacher or student demonstrations? So in making sense of what the first part, that's kind of wordy, making sense of the first part of it, it's asking, are students doing these things, or, and then there's kind of a non-example that's been given to kind of help explain what it is by looking at what it isn't. I'm going to ask us to do the same thing with the other 7 statements that are there. Not all of us doing all 7 of them, but to break them into, each pair has a couple of them to do. So let's move around the table real quick. With this trio, take statements 1 and 2. Okay. And if you guys would take, 3's done, so we'll take statements 4 and 5. Okay. And if you guys would take statements 6 and 7. And if you guys would take statement 8 and 1. So we've got two groups that are doing number 1. So when we start this off, we'll have 2 different ones to kind of think about. So 1 and 2, 3 is done, 4 and 5, 6 and 7, 8 and 1. And if you would think together with your group, your trio or your pair, how might you add a parenthetical or and a description afterwards to help us make sense of what that statement is by providing an example of what it isn't, or a non-example? What questions do you have for me before I turn you loose?
She said again.
Sure. I'm going to ask you to take the 2 statements that you and your partner were just given, take them one at a time. Read through the question and think about what you might add to the end, and then a non-example to help us make sense of what the question is actually asking.
Add to the end, or a non-example to make sense of the
Add to the end the word or with a non-example.
Number 3.
Similar to number 3. So for like question number 1, it says, notice and use regularity and repeated reasoning to make sense, justify, conjecture, and or generalize about the math ideas and problems. Or, and then add some words in there to say what it isn't.
Here's where we're going. Giving non-example to clarify what it is.
Yes.
Starting with the word all.
Yes.
Or.
Yep. And then give your non-example of what it isn't. Yep.
Is there blank paper in here somewhere?
There isn't, but I'd be happy to grab some for you.
I'm not there.
Yeah. No, I'm not. That's, I don't. I mean, I've got a variety in there if you.
Which one is it?
Sure.
You want one paper, but.
Kind of trying to
Or
work.
not to be.
I don't know if you want the blank paper or not, but I'll leave it with you.
Just
If
coming
you
up
want
with
to doodle on that instead of in your book.
Answers.
Yeah, so this is one way.
Or what he just described as that, what our students do. That would be
Or if you
or-
want blank paper to
Or
write on.
they just look at the problem and just give up on it. Yeah.
That's it.
Just
Like that.
I don't know.
Solve it.
So you're trying to say what it's not. So, because then when you give an example of what it's not, then we know better what it is.
Contra-positive.
Or notice and use patterns in structure to make sense of conjectures, justify, or generalize about methods.
And or every day. You know, you kind of use those connections as the basis for solving problems.
Maybe number 2 is they just.
So, is this more like a personal, or is it like, you know, word directing them to do this?
Not using.
You know, it's kind of, so first I put that, what we're going to ask. You know, so then they're just doing an activity, or is it where they're self-monitoring?
One about notice and patterns.
Is that
You know,
what,
those
is the opposite of what they're saying? Is
Right.
they give up on it?
Right, the 2 things that this says is to understand and to understand.
Yeah, first we're planning.
So that would be,
Right.
Because I guess they.
I thought you complained about it.
stay on sequence,
I just didn't know if
Yeah.
Because it's just trying to get you right after the David Ferris in 6th grade.
You stopped answering the phone to emergency cell.
Okay, so this will make sense to me. So you're
not pursue any
Give me an
other
example of
statute
a
links
connection that with that.
Sure.
That's what I think.
Right, no, that's what I mean, that's the missing part of the model, or, you know, we're setting up as an answer to me, where it says that that's what we're looking to model. So it should be like a question like, or are they only coming
Or
the
don't
numbers
just
that are
understand, give up on the problem, engage with the problem.
So the thing is,
Conditions is
That's
like-
something every single teacher.
The second one, I think, is like,
Is that right?
Let alone
It's really, I think what you're saying is you, the mathematician really dives into the problem,
so a real.
thinks about it.
Maybe that one's like, well, why did that work?
Yeah.
You say, oh, 'cause you told me, or like, she said, or that's, you know, that's the reason, or just because. or-
Because of this algorithm.
Yeah.
Okay, done enough for that one?
Instead of saying like,
Seek to understand, give up on the problem, don't engage in the problem, or what you just say.
yeah, that's good. So they just memorize the algorithm.
Or are they, are students just following the process?
There is another one.
Two negative numbers, negative number of negative numbers equals.
Without being able to.
exactly, I was like,
Without being able to understand the
Any more fight with me might
And then you see them do something completely wrong, and you're like,
do regular.
it's copying.
But it, so it could be
Yeah, right, just in general.
or sometimes geometric pattern that they're seeing as a automatic function, so, yeah.
Laura, what does that use regularity even mean?
This one here?
Yeah.
So
Use regularity.
regularity is kind of along the same lines as a pattern. So what is happening regularly within either a string of problems or within the mathematical
Okay,
work.
pattern, yeah.
So it could be, like if you're working on linear functions, a regularity would be that the slopes are always constant in all of our linear functions. Even though we have different contexts and have different slopes and different y-intercepts,
Yeah.
the regularity is that we all have constant.
Ask them to go
That
more in
also
depth.
might come out of looking at some patterns.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Class, ask them to explain it even more with the
So if you could just give me a quick, how much more time would you like?
Fine, 3 minutes.
3 minutes? Okay, let's take 3 minutes. Is that, you need 3
Okay.
minutes? Are you guys done with your two?
Sure.
Okay. My trio, you guys are done with your two? Okay. Okay.
No, we don't go with it.
So,
Oh, wait, there's 2 people doing number 1 anyway.
did you guys start with 8?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Churro,
So-
like a snack?
Yeah.
No,
So let's,
No, I think she said red churro.
tree.
Oh, trio.
yeah. Are you thinking lunch already?
Red churro.
I'm sorry, I'll try to
I
enunciate.
clearly haven't had much sleep. It's all right, carry on.
Let's share,
Don't get me wrong.
let's share how you're finishing these statements as a way to help us make sense of what the questions are really asking. So let's start with number 1. So the trio, would you guys like to go first, please? Or I shouldn't say that, I'm gonna catch myself. Would you please go first?
We said what it's not.
Okay, so how would you finish that sentence? Or,
Yeah, it says or, so.
Are students coming up with only the answer?
okay? So rather than, they're making sense, making conjectures, justifying or generalizing, are they only coming up with the answer? Okay? You guys also had, so you guys had number 1. How might you,
The only thing that we,
Or.
okay, or? Woohoo!
or just ignore patterns to come up with an answer.
Okay. Or maybe ignore some of the patterns and just look.
Don't
Okay.
make sense of the problem.
Mhm. Yeah, there's lots of things that it's not.
Right.
I'm gonna come back over here. You guys had number 2 as well. So that was notice and use patterns and structures.
Or are students only using algorithms without understanding them?
Or only using algorithms without understanding. 3 was done. Matt and Dan, number 4. That's about mathematical connections.
Or they're just not making any connections between.
Yeah, or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or they're not making connections. So we had a quick conversation back there. When you're thinking about connections, what are you guys thinking about?
it can be connections, within the math context that you're teaching, based on operations, variables, or it can be applied to other subjects, like graphs, for example, in science, and then also in math, being able to pull the data from it and use it effectively.
So we had talked a little bit about the work we did yesterday, that we were making some connections between the equation that was given and the visual models that were being built or drawn and the context or the everyday life we were coming up with. And we had a pretty lengthy conversation with quite a bit of making sense and then critiquing and debating around one of the contexts, trying to really make sure that what we were writing matched and went with or connected to the number sentence yesterday. So thinking about those connections, as well as the one that you just called out, where you might be making connections between something in mathematics and science, might be between where slope is showing up in a table and in a graph and an equation if you're working with some kind of function, specifically a linear function there. Let's also think about number 5, mistakes and stuck points.
So they're either gonna start new lines of reasoning to generate new conjectures, or they give up.
Okay? So if they make a mistake or get stuck, they give up.
They're not persevering.
Yep, or not persevering. Okay? Yep. Absolutely. So thinking about the culture that we're building in our classrooms and really wanting kids to recognize that when they get stuck or when they make a mistake, that's not a bad thing.
Right.
That's just a point of where some new learning is going to take place. We don't want to leave them there, but that's not necessarily a bad thing by itself. And let's use that as a point of learning.
Are these 8 questions, the 8 green things at the bottom there?
Connection made.
Okay, so do you think they're the green habits of interaction or the orange habits of mind?
Rebuttal.
Mathematical practices.
Oh, or are they the mathematical practices?
They're all 8.
They're all
What you're calling out, Steve, is really important. And if you were to look at the italicized words throughout the teacher reflection tool, the italicized words in here really are the habits of mind.
Okay.
Yeah. So the questions that we're asking ourselves, thank you very much. I'll bring you the chocolate for the transition. That's actually the question I typically ask after we've been all the way around. That's great.
Bam.
Bam is right.
Gifted.
Thanks for blurting out.
No, it's
We
great.
saved us all, man. Nice work.
Yeah.
Well, now we're doing 4 days.
So we're going to look at a couple other tools, and Matt, my next question to you is going to be, what might you be connecting the next tool to?
One.
But again, these are how we want kids to do mathematics, and this is how we want them to interact with each other. So when we think about, is there sense making, reasoning, and understanding, we're really after these pieces. Because we want them to make sense, justify, and generalize about the math. When we think about the culture in the classroom and how kids are working together, which is one of the other teacher reflection tools that we'll look at in just a moment, we're really thinking about the habits of interaction. And there are 4 tools that align with these 4 big pieces of research. This is essentially the habits of mind. This is essentially the habits of interaction. We're going to think about how tasks can be used to help both of these pieces come alive. And then this is us. This is what we do as facilitators of the learning in the classroom to make all of this happen. Yep. So let's finish this up real quick. Statement 6.
Oh, we got it. We connected the dots.
So how would you finish this specific one, though? This is about multiple
You
pathways.
said or, so only considering their pathway that they use, or only one pathway.
So only considering one pathway, only considering the way they were thinking about it.
Yeah, they're only the process that they know and use, not anything else, and anything else, well, no, that's gotta be wrong, 'cause it's not mine.
Yeah, absolutely. And how about number 7?
I said, or we both kind of agreed that solving without thought or reflection, basically coming to a solution and then moving on, right or wrong, doesn't matter.
Yep.
Next one, do the next one.
And we talked a little bit about that yesterday, that sometimes kids will think that the answer is correct because they got the answer, or because their calculator told them.
Yeah.
We ask them why is it correct and they can't explain it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why is it correct?
But getting them to then reflect on, is that answer reasonable? Could that answer be correct? You know, if their calculator is giving them, in quotes, giving them something, what might be going on? You know, having them recognize that the calculator is only gonna do what we told them, what we told it to do. So that reflection piece can be key.
So I shouldn't be calling to get a new calculator?
Yeah.
Well, you could, but they might be going through a lot of calculators before they get there.
I sell them on this one.
There we go. Let's come up here to the front group again with statement number 8.
The opposite we said was, don't seek to understand the problem, give up, don't engage or ask questions, and don't ask what comes next. And I guess in my practice, the example would be just reading the problem once and going, I don't get it.
Yep.
Just giving up,
Yep.
which happens.
Yeah. Or do you ever get kids to put IDK on their paper?
Yes, I do actually. One particular
I get IGN because
Thinking about that piece, so if you have a student who says, I don't understand or I don't know, how do you respond to them? What do you say that might support their persevering or seeking more?
I challenge them to ask another question.
Okay, fantastic. So then what question do you have? If I'm not sure, what question do I have?
Or let's read the problem again, or let's sit down, I mean,
Okay.
lots of times it's just a matter of not even engaging.
Says it there, or page 141, they're the exact same teacher reflection. I just took you to the part of the notebook where all 4 of them are listed together. But they're the same topic. Just a gauge for me, is the weather is kind of and part of it's habit. Once again, I'm going to have you check in with your partner or partners and share with them either something that kind of jumped out at you, but I really want you to think about, is there any evidence that I was thinking about those 4 pieces as I prepared and came in and facilitated yesterday's work? And if so, what might that evidence be? Or what question might you have for me about that?
Can we ask you questions now?
Sure. Or if you guys want to chat real quick, and then, or maybe Dan has some questions. Then you're welcome to ask me any questions.
Sure.
No, you may not.
So, yes, you just, I'm going to ask you to talk to your partner first. How's that?
There you go.
That's funny. No lady teachers here.
Bunch of guys.
Bunch of cackling dudes.
My question, I wouldn't mind everyone here.
There you go.
Oh, there you
Yay,
go.
she's here.
It's
This
a
is
break.
not- it's not quiet.
No.
This is not a break. This is not a break.
This is how it's going today.
We're on
We
day
had our
2.
first break.
This is not a
You're
break.
doing well.
Seth is very
It's
true.
not
Carbon
reflective.
I know, like,
Put the
Done.
lights on off.
The lights is on. Oh, because of
You
the.
want to go into
working on
to,
this.
do things, and so
Okay.
it's being shown to
Hey,
you.
she definitely did private music.
Regular, that's good. 141.
I'm loving that.
So yeah, she has definitely, there's evidence, there's evidence that she is other because she's
In-depth
dropped how
conversation.
many tasks.
I get it.
She's structured our interaction to really well.
Show me how to do that 5 times a day.
Listen intently to what we say.
For number 3,
And
yes,
plan.
sir.
I've got, and I don't have, but it's middle
I
school.
have no idea.
Press meeting. You know what?
And all eighth grade is out.
Yeah.
All eighth grade.
So they
Good point, form was up, form
The
was
sixth,
up.
seventh, and eighth grade math curriculum, they crammed into
I
sixth.
guess the
seventh
part
grade.
that I really would like to know that is the
So I've got more.
questions about structuring
Yeah.
interaction.
But,
So that's,
no, she
you
did
know,
because
Yeah, just go deep.
show me in a 51-minute lesson here, how you do this.
With
That's-
30 with 30 kids.
Or someone obnoxious like me.
Or
I'll be honest, you
four
know,
of you in
that's, that makes sense, that translates into what I do in my classroom.
Yeah,
So I think your question that you're asking is really important, and I want to just highlight it for just a moment. I'm going to take first one, and then I think, I'll get back, I would take what we did.
I have no problem saying how you take, I'm saying how you show
Would
me.
you prefer pencil or
Don't
pen?
talk to me about it.
Okay.
That works.
Is that different than EMS?
Then what I would encourage you to think about
Otherwise,
is,
Yeah.
there are three different.
gotcha.
I
Zora.
don't know, show me.
I did. So I did
That was
none
it.
of which, each piece of that, none of which was
So, it follows.
subtraction. So I'm not indicating you should take the subtraction of divisions and division of fraction and put all on one lesson. Yeah, so each of those chunks where we went through this process was under an hour.
Oh, God, maybe so.
So if you think about it as if we had, just more structured calling it, and I get that piece. But each of those math lessons was less than an hour. But I think that question is huge. Because we do, when we go back to class, and I understand this because I absolutely, I sat right here, I mean, it's been a number of years ago now, but I sat right here and thought, I'm gonna teach, what was the other page, I'm gonna do this. And then a couple of years later, it was,
Oh, no. I asked my question, why didn't it be, why not? I wasn't
What was the page we were looking at before, where we?
One,
Very well.
35, which is actually the same as 138 before, 138.
More out.
What
The guy
it
was
is,
Sorry, Steve, so
Creative,
so she just was already hanging out with everybody.
yeah, and then talk about, okay.
Now you're that guy.
Oh, this was last night?
Oh,
2 days now, 2 days in January. Those 4 days.
yeah, okay.
Kind of setting
Is this
I
Ann?
mean, those.
Run, no, there's Annie Henry too, there's also Annie Henry, that's the other Steve Henry that died, his daughter, yeah, exactly. What's your daughter's name? Kirsten. So much living in the dorm.
I know she was trying to save up money.
All these guys.
We get to observe it.
Bunch of little repetitive.
It could be that it's.
And I have, they're okay. Yeah, I teach.
Couple of minutes here.
We asked those.
You've been looking at the teacher reflection tool about mathematically productive teaching. I'm going to start with, I want you to think with me, is there evidence that I thought about some of these things before I came in? And then we were just having a conversation back here in the corner that I think other people were thinking about, but I want to share that conversation because it might either allow some questions to surface or it might answer some questions. But let's go after the evidence first. Any evidence that I might have been thinking about these things?
Yes.
Okay. So what's the evidence?
Well, let's see, structured our interaction by
Mhm.
coming up with thoughtful ways for us to interact.
So structuring student talk.
Right.
So I'm going to just physically move over and touch some of these things as you talk about it. So thinking about the mathematically productive teaching
Even
routines.
to back up from there, you gave us private think time.
Okay, so I was structuring student talk, but part of that was providing some private reasoning time.
You're always wandering around and monitoring us.
Absolutely. So,
You know, I don't know if that sounded like a positive or negative.
but I think
That's power, it drove your Academy Award chances.
so,
Well, then,
so the,
More positive.
I appreciate the way you wander around and monitor us.
Oh, that doesn't, yeah.
but I just want to be transparent right there. Part of that monitoring is really formative for me.
Right.
And it could be as simple as, so Steve asked me, we're reading right now, why are you wandering around? And that's a great question. So part of it is I was peeking over shoulders, and those that are highlighting or writing, I kind of got a gauge of where you were in your reading. I was also kind of looking to see where eyes were looking. Are you at the top of the page or the bottom page? I can't tell what you're reading. But are you still at the top, or are you getting near the bottom? So just as a gauge for when are you ready to start that conversation. Same thing can happen in the classroom. Are kids writing things down? What are you noticing? Are they starting to get fidgety? I mean, those things you're
Are you
monitoring
talking
for.
about the right things?
I like how you shared about you see the way that if you problems, you see, oh, okay, how that gauges your next interaction with the collaboration
Yes.
of the guided questions, and say, okay, let's take a look at this group and have them share what they're doing. Do you know if I can build with that and that and that?
Absolutely. So if I see a lot of students are stuck, I might stop and do something quickly. You have 30 seconds, turn and tell your partner how you're getting started. Okay, now back to some prior reasoning time, because I want to make sure everybody has something to start with. If I see a lot of kids writing things down and they're working through things, even if they're not completely done, because they can continue to think with their partner, then the question might be, talk to your partner about how this is making sense, or the connections between your equation and your visual, or whatever it is that we're working on.
Yeah, I think it's too often times and I'm sure at least I'm guilty of it, I use the wandering as the negative. Who can I find that's off task? How can I find somebody that's not talking about it, or how can I find somebody that's not doing it? I mean, example, why are you wandering or reading? Like, I feel like maybe thinking like it's a negative thing rather than a positive thing, and I think that if I change that concept, look at
You're gonna see what you look for.
exactly,
Yes.
right.
So again, and I think that's really important what you're calling out. So looking for how are students making sense of whatever it is you're having to work on. So the byproduct is that proximity might help someone stay on task, or it might stop a conversation that got started. So there might be some byproducts of what we might also monitor for, but really using it as a formative data collection method of thinking about that. Yeah, absolutely. So Seth, were there other things you wanted to call out?
And then obviously you, at the end, after the group thing, we did talking about looking for validity and the reason, looking for our reasoning as
Yeah.
a group conversation, yeah.
Yes. Pressing that math reasoning is the authority. It shouldn't be right because, somebody specifically in this room said it, or a specific student said it, or the calculator said it, but thinking about why does it work mathematically. So coming back over here to the mathematically productive teaching routines, and again, we haven't delved into these in a lot of depth. We spent some time on structuring student talk, but thinking about these other routines and where you might have seen them come out. Selecting and sequencing student ideas. Okay. As we were publicly processing each of the math pieces yesterday, there were specific people I had asked to share out. A couple of things I was thinking about was how do I get multiple voices up there over the course of the day, so trying not to go back to the same people, yet at the same time telling a story by getting the different meanings out. And when I did this, for the most part, I started with the meaning for each of the operations that I saw the most of in the classroom. You don't have to do it that way, but that was something that was on my mind. So when we were thinking about subtraction yesterday, lots and lots of examples of takeaway, but not a specific example of the comparing. Everybody was thinking about it in some way around positives and negatives, but not necessarily with two sets of positives and comparing or looking for the difference between those. So that's why that one went second. Public records. Okay. Working with public records of students' mathematical thinking. To the best of my ability, what went up on the public records yesterday was your thinking. I didn't bring them in already created and hang them up and say, here, make sense of these. We created those together. Okay. Yeah. Conferring with student mathematicians. So I dropped in with table groups. If you spend much time with me, you're pretty quickly going to recognize my hip pocket question, which is, tell me a little bit more about your thinking. So that's my way of entering into a conversation with, whether it's you guys or whether it's students in the classroom, without taking away their opportunity to think, just to be genuinely curious. I want to know what they're making sense of before I decide to do something about it, one way or the other. So tell me a little bit about your thinking. Tell me a little bit more about that. Just trying to draw out those ideas. Working with students' mathematical representations, we had everyday life up there, we had verbal up there. I gave you the number sentence, so we were using that as the anchor for connecting the other representations. We had visual models. Okay. If you were working with functions, it could be the table, the graph. If you're working with fractions, it could be an area model, it could be, how they're showing, how they're multiplying or dividing or adding or whatever it is that they're doing. And then working with students' mathematical errors and misconceptions. That didn't come out in a big way yesterday because we didn't have a lot of that here as adults. But we did think about different ways you might do that with students. Putting out a misconception along with the correct answer and asking students which of these is correct and how do you know? Or putting something out there and asking kids, could this work and how do you know? But thinking about how we're going to work with those in a productive way, especially if you've got misconceptions happening across the classroom. So the question, before we move to the question, anything else you're noticing or wondering about in terms of those mathematically productive teaching pieces?
I like how this is set up though, because it kind of gives you a flow of how to do this. It's good.
Is that in this book?
On page 10 or 11 of all the pages. Teaching routines are at the bottom of page 10, and they are slowly morphing a little bit in terms of the names of them as more and more research is being gathered. So what's there is pretty darn close to what I have up there, but not word for word for all 6 of them. Because like the mathematical errors and misconceptions isn't listed on page 10, but it's now part of what we're working on because that's a big piece of working with students. And in the past, it just hadn't been called out as an explicit routine.
Right, I meant this one.
Oh, yeah.
Effective.
Yep, absolutely. That's on the top of page 9. It's the first bulleted, or the first bold piece at the top of page 9 where it says effective mathematics classrooms. And then there are the 4 bullets down below.
Good.
I do want to come over to Matt and have him share his question that he asked when I was wandering by.
My question was, this all makes sense logically to me. Why are you not showing it to us in the same time frame process that we have in real life with our students?
And what might it look like in 51 minutes?
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of things that I kind of tossed out for Matt to think about is, one, if you were to think about the math that we did yesterday, we kind of had 3 different chunks of it. We did some subtraction, and then a little bit later after we had some conversations with teachers, we did some work around division of whole numbers. We had more conversation, and we had some work around division of a whole number by a unit fraction. So if you think about those 3 separate chunks, each of those chunks was less than an hour. So the fact that we went through the process of sharing the prompt, you guys had some private reasoning time, you talked to the partner, we did some public processing, and at times we went back to some of the work. But thinking about those mathematically productive teaching routines, our engagement in the habits of mind and habits of interaction, each of those rotations or chunks or whatever you want to call them were about the length of a class period. And that was intentional. So the fact that we had 3 different pieces of it with conversations in between makes up or starts to put together our full day of professional development. So the other part of that is, what does this look like with kids? It's one thing to come in and do it with adults. What does it look like in a classroom with 30 students in 51, 54, however long you have for your class
That's
period?
where Renee volunteered to have us.
So I don't know if any of the admin want to speak to this, but so I can share that when Teachers Development Groups thinks about this professional development, there's multiple parts to this. One part is these 4 days that we're going to spend together, 2 here in November and then 2 in January. And those 4 days are intended to kind of lay the groundwork for us as adults together to be able to make sense of those mathematically productive teaching routines, habits of mind, habits of interaction, to be able to brainstorm together what it might look like, how we might do this with students, and kind of generate those base ideas and make sense of it together. The next part of that professional development would be to do exactly what Matt is asking for, which is where we would get together, sometimes as a larger group, but oftentimes it's a school team, and we would think really hard about a lesson together. Where are the places we're going to have kids, or where we're going to structure their talk? How are we going to help them make sense of the math? Where are they going to be justifying? And we go into a classroom and enact that lesson with kids. Oftentimes their first time out, it would be me that would teach that lesson so we could think about that together. It doesn't have to be me all the time. It certainly can be whoever's classroom we're in. But thinking really hard then about what does that look like real time with kids, Then we come out of the classroom and we get to think together, kind of debrief that. What were the kids making sense of? What's our evidence? What did we do to support that opportunity to make sense, justify, generalize? What else could we have done? It's not that it's right or wrong or good or bad, but we're just getting that opportunity to kind of slow down around a lesson, but it's live with students. So we're always going to do the mathematics that that particular group of kids needs next. It's not about coming in with some made-up lesson that we think is going to work really well. It's about thinking, if we're in an 8th grade classroom and they're working on linear functions, what are they going to do tomorrow if we weren't coming? That's the mathematics we're going to work on. But we're going to do it in this way, and we'll do it together. One of the questions that usually comes up is, what do the kids think when you have 6 adults come walking in the classroom? They are really, really good at ignoring us, because the rest of us aren't going to interact with them. So it's not like we're dropping 6 teachers into a classroom. They're great. I mean, for the most part, kids are great. They just ignore us. They know that we're there to, to learn from them, and they just do their thing, and then we get to pay attention to what they're saying and what they're doing. And again, those are some decisions that, as a district, you'll have to make in terms of when that might happen, or how that might happen, how often that might happen. But that would be kind of the next step after this opportunity to be together for 4 days. Because that comes down to it. It's one thing to learn about something, but how do we take it back and do this with kids? Because that's the key. That's what we're after. Other questions?
So do you find that, like, when you go into rooms and watch people, do people do like some of these really well and ignore others?
In terms of the habits?
Sure.
So in some classrooms, so in classrooms where making sense, justifying, generalizing is at the core of what's happening every day, there are often references to the habits on a regular basis. It doesn't mean teachers are stopping every single lesson and having big discussions about it, but you'll hear the language of the habits coming out of not only the teacher's mouth, but also the kids. And you'll see somebody pointing over there, or there might be a quick question about what are we doing right now. But we're talking short little pieces, not 10 minutes of instruction time. They just become habitualized by both, exactly, by both the teacher and the students, so that they just kind of become, this is how we do math in here. When they're first introduced, doing some of the things that we've already talked about can be really helpful. Pointing to them, asking the kids, what habit did you just engage in? Putting stickies up, calling it out when you hear it. Again, things that don't necessarily have to take a long time, but can really point kids over to, those are visual reminders of what we want to be doing in our classroom. I mean, just hanging them up is probably not going to do it. Other questions? And as for the teaching routines, part of that first, chunk of studio work is really that chance to dig in and think about what those look like live with students. So I would encourage you to, go back to your rooms Wednesday and try some of these things and keep track of what's working and where do you have questions. But then also thinking about the fact that it takes, anytime we're gonna, make little shifts in what we do, it takes time. Also be thinking about, what do you already do that matches up with what we're talking about? Because I would venture to guess that if I were to walk into any of your classrooms, there are elements of this that are already happening. So being reflective about, where do you already do some of these things and where can you build from that? And then maybe what are some things that you haven't tried on that you would be willing to try on? And think about how to mesh together your current practice with some of the pieces that we've been talking about.
And that might be a little piece of what we've just been talking about, because I know even with the TDG training that we had in the past, and some people have or haven't been there, we've kind of instituted a lot of those protocols and practices across all our content areas, not just the math kind of piece like that. So the question has been in my mind, if I was in your shoes and thinking about, okay, I do the turn and talk, I do this, I do. Is there any subtlety, or is there any a nudge to that might make that a little bit more intentional than am I listening for anything that maybe changes the way that I think about the use of that? Maybe not, but just that going that extra layer on there, because I do think, I know, and Ginger and I were talking about it, these kinds of protocols and stuff you're saying too. We do see the teachers are using this and really show some proficiency in some of that area. So how do we nudge to go even a little bit more intentional, a little deeper on it, whatever that might look like?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Other questions? So I keep the questions coming, because that's how we all make sense of this together. Nice. So, so when we come into your classroom, when the kids do that,
Epiphany or something.
Yeah.
Right.
it's so to take, I mean, I know that was meant a little bit in humor, but what you just did. No, well, the holding it up.
You said it, I looked at it, I was like,
Yeah.
whoa, this is happening.
But what you just did
Yeah.
happens in classrooms too. So sometimes those habits aren't necessarily adhered to the wall, you know, with staples or whatever. Sometimes people will put them up someplace where they have magnets or they can put a thumbtack in it where it's easy to take it down. And they'll do exactly what Seth just did. They'll go over and grab one of the posters and, you know, hold it up or walk around with it for a moment, especially if it's a big deal, like the making sense, the justifying, or the generalizing. So no, I wasn't trying to poke at you. I was just saying, well, what you just did.
We planned together last
Yeah.
night. Well, and I planned, so.
And I'm going to owe people so much chocolate for all these transitions. All right. Keep thinking about these pieces. Keep thinking about questions that you have. I'm going to ask us to jump into a little bit of math together. Okay? So if you would. Oops, it went too far. If you would turn to page 39 in your notebook. And on page 39, you essentially have a blank piece of paper with a very short prompt at the top. So I'm going to ask you to take a little bit of private reasoning time here. Okay? So a little quiet time to think about this, and you can write right on this sheet. But I want you to draw a diagram or model. Okay? So a diagram or model that creates a convincing argument, we're thinking about justifying, a convincing argument that the sum of two odd numbers is always an even number. So page 39, I want you to draw a diagram or a model that creates a convincing argument that the sum of two odd numbers is always an even number. Will, do you want to join us, or?
Yeah, I'll jump over in a second once we get set, I'll set the camera and then.
Okay, and are you going to be Rebecca's partner here?
Sure.
Or- Okay, so we'll come over here and jump in here. So in just a moment, I'm going to ask you to check in with your partner. And I'm going to ask the person who is sitting closest to the back of the room to start this time. So whoever's sitting closest to the exit will start after they've shared one of their representations and why they think it's a convincing argument. Then I want the second person to share one of their ideas. And then when you get a chance to talk together, I want you to really then think about how might either or both of your representations be a convincing argument that the sum of any two odd numbers is an even. Okay? Questions? No? Okay, and up here at the front, I'm going to let you guys, as adults, in the classroom I would just tell you, but as adults, you guys decide who's sitting closest to the back.
Well, if I pick one of us and
Yeah, so here comes Dan right there. So
All right.
I mean,
pair,
I just
pair,
can't
ooh.
put a statement that any other
Yep.
plus one is,
Okay.
right?
You want to go this way with the tree, or do you want to go this way with the tree? Okay, okay. So then let's start here and just go ABC.
I just started making examples of guys, people's times 85 was, and I think, I mean, really, for the city model, I think this is the key.
Even number is always.
Yeah.
Nor do I think any of these experts prove that all
The
these
definition of outside, yeah,
Therefore,
this one, I'm gonna use like all, if I put all.
No, I don't really understand the diagram or model what person's looking at. I would just go straight to the beginning. I go with numbers, you know, just like just showing, illustrating different reasons. I was like, well, I need to do a diagram or a model.
flowchart,
I
like it.
don't know, I'm
Yeah.
curious to see other
I
people's
mean,
models.
I guess the modeling of that would be the most difficult.
I was trying to prove
I
it.
think.
Algebraically.
Two separate.
Did you get it, Ian?
No.
I had like, there's
I wish I had known.
yeah. You need a higher.
I remember having to do it go.
To just
Oh, you did?
practice.
With the math, with an algebra?
We had to take like a proofs class where we had to like solve it in front of the class. And this was definitely one of them.
Oh.
I remember you'd like randomly get caught. Yeah. Or your grade was like showing you on the chalkboard.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess
Add one, which is a given.
I don't know how much more model I could make, but I'm sure there's something.
I just use
I mean, I could keep going and going and going as it's.
odd numbers and then just show them.
Examples, yeah, what?
Compare them up.
You win.
Yeah.
There's a pair here, and there's an odd one.
Yeah.
There's a pair here and an odd one.
Yeah.
You're always gonna have that.
I mean, I don't
Yeah.
know. Numbers.
On top of that.
I think any odd number plus one
I
equals
took
even
all
number.
the numbers, odd
Yep.
numbers to 10 and then just
So you read that book,
illustrated
yeah?
numerically and then tried to draw a couple pictures to like show it, which I don't even know really why I do that.
Yeah, because we were told.
But I was very.
Oh, I know, I'll go put it in there, sounds good.
Gave one of my algebra classes, free algebra. So yeah, I worked on that actually, yeah. What we should be pushing
Alright, I can grab your attention.
He's a smarter mathematician. Is he a challenge to the problem?
Pull this together real quick. So, again, thinking about that convincing argument that the sum of any two odd numbers is even. Okay? So while you guys were working, I was walking around and picking up some of the pieces that you were doing. So if you saw me peeking over your shoulder and scribbling notes, I was gathering some of the strategies that I saw floating around here. This is not all of them, but it's a representation of what was being thought about around the piece. So I saw a number of, I mean, not these specific numbers came off of somebody's paper, but I saw examples like this where people were thinking about, some specific examples. What do you think they were doing here?
Visually?
So some of this might go right here, so 1 plus 1 is 2.
2 odd numbers and a even.
Yep, and then this person had 1 and 3, so you have 4. That shows that this one here went with one of these over here. Saw this. So defining that an odd is an even plus 1. So then if we have an even plus 1, so we have an odd, and an even plus 1, and another odd, we end up with 2 of those. And then we have 2 evens plus 2. So what do we know mathematically about anything we've multiplied by 2?
Even.
So that's getting closer. So that's not necessarily, I mean, it could be a model, but I don't think that's what most people are thinking about when they think about a model. What about this? Find an odd is an even plus 1. That and didn't show for a while, did it? Plus 1. An even plus 1. Another odd is an even plus 1. This became an even because they had an even plus 2. And then saw this with the dots in there. So any odd, this is 1 extra. And then this over here, these two would then go together. So the leftovers match up. So one of those would be a convincing argument or a justification that the sum of any 2 odd numbers is an even number.
I like the last
The
one.
one that makes most sense to me is the last one.
This one down here? Okay. So let's say that you saw a student do this. What would your question be to them to help bring out that thinking? Prove it? Okay.
Show another example.
Can you show another example?
You show an example when it doesn't show
I
an
was
odd.
gonna say, could you ask the class to try to find a counterexample?
Okay. Because how many counterexamples would it take in order to say that that's not always true? 1. Yeah. So if they can come up with, I mean, in this particular case, they might look for a while because we do know mathematically that.
That's how you spent 51 minutes doing this, man.
Not unless you have your core math idea. My first question is, what do you want the kids to understand here? But thinking about the fact that you might want to, so I'm going to use I might use my hip pocket question. Can you tell me a little bit about your thinking? Because I'm curious about why they're thinking about any odd number or how this might represent any odd. I mean, I see the dots in there, so I'm envisioning that means that I can have any number of pairs in there. What about the student who did this? What might you ask them about that might push them for that generalization, that justification?
Show them how.
Okay. So you could ask them, could you give me a picture or could you build a model of what that might look like? You might ask kids, what's their connection between this and this? So you could have this student share their thinking, this student share their thinking, and then say to them, how do these 2 ideas connect together? Because this would be a visual model, but this is probably getting closer to a rule. But thinking about, so part of this is then really getting a chance to think about what does it mean to have kids justify? And if they're justifying a statement that's a general rule, what does it mean? Can they do that with a few examples? Because if we were going to do this, and I know a lot of people started here just because they're making sense of what that was, so I'm not trying to imply that that was the end of the thinking, but if this was what kids did, how many examples would they have to do in order to be able to show or prove or justify that that statement is always true?
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
How
So
much does it take?
why would it be infinite?
Well, because of the way this is phrased, right? Always.
Yep. So we're looking. Yep. We're looking to show that the sum of any 2 odd numbers. So we would have to do proof by exhaustion, and that would be more than your 51 minutes.
It's gonna be a whole year lesson.
So then helping kids think about how they can take some concrete specific examples and maybe
You know,
when
I
one
could
falls.
turn that around on you and say, show me one that doesn't work.
Mhm. So you could ask me, you know, and again, that goes back to that counter example.
Yeah.
So if I'm working with this,
If it works every, show me one that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Also.
so if I'm having run through every example trying to find the one that doesn't work, that's sort of like going on that proof by exhaustion, because I'm not gonna find two odd numbers that when I add them together are gonna give me an odd. But I might be able to talk to you about this down here, because what I'm saying down here, if this is my work, is that I could have any number of pairs. If I know an odd number is some number of pairs plus one left over, then it doesn't matter what the number is. If there's pairs, then they're in here, and I have one more. There could be 3, and it could be, 3009. It could be billions and 137, or 13579 on the end. And I've got the same thing over here. So if I know the definition of what it means to be odd, then I'm not gonna be able to provide a counterexample because it doesn't exist.
Which just makes me think, again, what I like about that is I can apply that logic to do, because every
Yeah.
number's gonna end, every odd number's gonna end with one of those numbers. You can just show the endings of odd numbers, and you can get the same, use the same logic.
So then you have to go,
139,
yeah.
yeah.
So then thinking about, well, why does that work? Why do if I have a number that ends in 13579, and I have another number that ends with one of those 5 numbers, why does it make it an even number? Okay. But so it could go back to some reasoning or some rationale through that column, or it might be that you're going to some kind of, I mean, you don't have to go to a visual, but it might be that you go to some kind of visual to show that those numbers are gonna have one left over. But again, thinking really hard about what does it mean to have kids justify, and when you're gonna ask kids to justify, doing a little bit of anticipating beforehand, what is it that you want kids to say? What do you want them to do? So that one, you recognize it when it's there, or when you see it close to being there, that maybe there's something you're gonna ask that student to kind of draw it out. So if you see, something like this, how could you press the student just a little bit more to think about why does this always work? But if I see this, what might I say to a student to help them recognize that they're gonna go through a lot of examples before they come up with, a convincing argument. And then,
No, see, they're not gonna have to come up with a lot. They only have to come up with 10.
okay,
Because every number ends with a 1, 3, 5, 7, or 9.
but then I can combine those in different ways, right?
Right.
Okay, but if they just did this, they're not done. So what else would you ask them to do? I mean, that's what I guess what I'm getting at.
Yes,
Yeah.
they'd have to do
Mhm.
all the odd numbers as opposed to that one, yeah.
So again, if you start to see this, then thinking about anticipating, what's your question gonna be to get the student to recognize that they have to do more than just those 3 examples? Yeah, absolutely. So again, planning for that opportunity to justify, and then anticipating what you want it to look like or sound like, including what you're gonna do if an idea doesn't come out. Right? So put yourself in my shoes for just a minute. What if I had just posed this task and everybody in the room did something like those top 2? What could I have done?
You could say, well, a student in another session showed me this, can I share it?
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. So I could have put any one of these on here, and then, in this case, because I gathered these ideas and then just turned it around and said, I saw these in the room, I could have added anything on here and then just turned it around and not said anything. I also could have said, a student in another class or another session thought about it like this. What do you guys think? Yep, absolutely.
Do you advocate one or several sources of rich tasks? Because someone is sharing rich tasks with me, and they come with these notions of here's what kids are going to respond to. Whereas the textbooks that we have do not. They just roll on.
So I'm just going to answer that personally. I don't think there's one great or perfect source to go to out there. What I would actually encourage you to think about is what are the resources that you have in front of you. So thinking about your textbook, whatever the curriculum is that your textbook or that your district's adopted, and then how can you pull from that so you're not having to recreate the wheel? And yesterday somebody had suggested that maybe we go to the end of the lesson and look at some of the contextual tasks or some of the richer tasks at the end and then use those first, set the stage with that.
I mean, these websites already exist, and they have
Yeah.
here's what kids are gonna do and here's what you
Yeah.
do
And it-
afterwards, so that's very time saving.
And so I mean, whatever curriculum you happen to be using, I would ask the same questions. How is this gonna help students reason about the math? How are you gonna facilitate the learning? Whether it's something you're pulling from a website, whether it's something from a textbook. And I'll be honest, that those questions really kind of come down to is what is okay within your district in terms of curriculum materials to be using. So if it.
Well, one of the things they're also creating is the digital library
Yeah.
that you're gonna start having access to for a lot of the math stuff.
But
It's not what they promised it would be yet. It's a work in progress, but that right now, you click on that does the same thing. It gives you other resources to pull from, like whole unit lessons and stuff like that.
I think where Doug's coming from is kind of like where I struggle, where I don't know how to set up the ideas that I'm seeing, where there are websites that have a task and they have it broken down. Students will show this, students will show this, this is what this means. So when I see, the top left, for example, I'm like, okay, where do I go with that? How do I direct their thinking? Because I don't know. And so there is material out there, and are you wondering, is there maybe more places that we don't know about? Was that your question, or which ones are appropriate, which ones are?
Yeah, I guess what I was saying is, what we're talking about is one method of teaching, and it's not direct instruction, which our book, we're gonna use our book, and who knows if we're gonna use our book and how long we're
So
gonna
if
use
you have access to materials that have some of that thinking there, and that's fantastic. I would still encourage you to think through that and make sure that what that other person, group, or whatever thought might happen is what you think might happen in your own classroom. So do your own anticipating or making sense about it. I think the question you're calling out, Renee, is really important. So part of this is anticipating what students might do. So if you get a chance to plan that lesson together, so let's think together. We've got this task we're going to give to kids. What are they going to do with it? Both correct and incorrect, or partial understanding. And then we might be able to anticipate, because I might think about this, Renee might think about this, but Will might think about this. And if we're planning this together, then we can take those ideas from each other.
And then the other idea is, one could build one's own notebook, which, would be super. And it would take some years of fine tuning and this and that. But people like Steve Henry don't have time. Steve's an old fella.
It's okay, Grandpa.
I wonder if anyone's figured out already a really nice, common core, aligned structure.
So I know textbook companies are working on that. So some of them have already done some of that transition. Some say they've done that transition, but if you go back and look, it's just rearrangement of the tasks. So we're going to spend a little bit of time this afternoon actually thinking about how to do this with the materials that you have. So you open up your book, you're looking at the lesson that you're going to teach tomorrow. How can you incorporate some of these ideas into it? And I'm not trying to oversimplify it, because it does take some thinking. It does take a little more thinking at first as you're building up that repertoire and thinking about the questions you want to ask, but then opening up the textbook, how do I do this quickly and efficiently in a way that's going to give my kids the opportunity to do that? And it could be that you look to the questions at the end and you pull out a rich task and you put it up front. Or you read the question that the textbook has asked and it says, what's the answer to? And you add, and how do you know you're right? Or justify your thinking. Or build a model to show this. It could be that you take those questions right out of the book. Maybe you find 2 or 3 questions that if I do these 3 in this order, that they're going to see a pattern. And you ask the kids to work on them in that order, and then ask them, what's happening each time? What's the pattern that's there?
Yeah.
You're thinking about how we add just quick taglines or quick questions around what's already there. Because we don't want you to have, if you have resources elsewhere, that's okay with the district, that's totally fine. But not wanting to turn us into curriculum writers, that's not we don't have time for that. But thinking about how do we do this with the materials we have in an efficient way, where we're giving kids that opportunity to really think deeply about the mathematics. And please give yourself permission to do this incrementally. Don't go back tomorrow and try to do everything we've talked about. think about how you can add on to things that you're already doing, make small tweaks along the way so that over the course of a little bit of time, that these are becoming part of how you do math.
And it's almost as if now you have to have the Common Core sitting next to you and the textbook sitting next to you, and making sure that you're teaching it in a Common Core, like you're addressing all the things Common Core is asking you to do, because just to go do a set of problems anymore isn't any good.
Right, but it could be that you're not just giving them a set of problems to do, but you're picking out 2 or 3 to have them do where you want them to see a
Right.
pattern.
Yeah, exactly.
So then you're pressing them to notice that pattern, you're asking the question, how do you know you're right, can you justify your thinking? What's always happening here? So that they're then thinking beyond just question 1, 2, 3, 4, but to a little broader.
Yeah.
But you're not having to reinvent the wheel. And it might be that you don't just use the 3 examples that come up first in the lesson where they're kind of naked number problems, that you go find that contextual one and intermix them a little bit so that kids are being able to make connections between something in life. Or pick out the rich problems or the contextual problems at the end that have something to do with their life. You know, so if they're thinking about, I mean, if you're working with 6th graders and the question's about a home mortgage, I mean, they know what a mortgage is, but they might not know the intricacies of a home mortgage. But they might be really interested in fundraising for a field trip. So finding the context problems that has to do something with that they know about that's going to help them make the connection. Or maybe it's you're working with your 8th graders around a car loan rather than a home mortgage. Because at 14 and 15, they're thinking about getting their driver's license and buying a car. And it could be that you even change a few words in that context. So if it's talking about, the middle school, yada, 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 in, Miami, Florida, that you change it to, your middle school here in Enumclaw, Washington, so that it's something that they're thinking about. I mean, and we're talking small changes here, things that could be done pretty quickly, but in a way that's going to make it relevant to them, engaging to them, and that you're pressing them to think hard about the math. I want to give you a chance to think about another classroom. So over our 4 days together, you're going to see clips from a variety of different grade levels. We saw a kindergarten classroom yesterday. I have to tell you that it is so much fun. If you get a chance and you've got some kindergarten or primary grades that are doing some of this work, go hang out in the kindergarten room. It is just fantastic when the kids are taking this on. And it's just one of those arguments that our 6th graders, our 8th graders, our 10th graders can really do this. And today you're going to get a chance to see a 4th grade classroom. Part of doing this work together was twofold on my part. One was to give us a chance to talk about what does it mean to justify? What's that convincing argument for every odd number? The second piece is that you're going to get a chance to see a young lady named Allison talking about this in the video. Okay. So if you would turn to page 41 in your notebook. There's a student discourse observation tool there. And if you would capture what is being said on the video as close as you can verbatim, because then we're going to talk a little bit about, did you hear some generalizing, did you hear some justifying, did you hear some procedures and facts? Okay. So I'm going to ask you to capture that as you're listening to Allison. Just once again, and I mentioned this yesterday, that anytime we have an opportunity to take a glimpse into somebody else's room, it's really a gift, and it's intended to give us an opportunity to think really hard about what students are doing and how a teacher might be supporting their students in thinking. So we're going to take that gift as it is. Again, this is a 4th grade classroom, and the students are working on the same problem that we were just thinking about. How can you create a convincing argument that the sum of 2 odd numbers is always an even number? Let's see, and can we lower the lights a little bit? Either off or just down a little bit, maybe it'll make the video.
This student has been working independently to justify the conjecture if you add an odd number to another odd number, you will get an even number. Her teacher asks her to share with the class how she would show that this conjecture is always true.
Well, every odd number always has one number too many, only one that, because so it's not an even number, because then when it divides into pairs, like 3, it's the next one, and like 6. All the pairs, the pairs are equal. There's 2 in each pair. And but the odd numbers always have 1 too many. You could add as many pairs as you want, and you still have the 1 extra. And so it works with every number. The evens, you always are adding another pair. But if the odd is another odd, these 2 would go together, you would have these other pairs.
So the extras would make a pair?
Yeah. That works with every odd.
It works with every odd number.
Because evens are made out of pairs, and odds are made of pairs with 1 extra.
We all go back.
Smarter than a fourth grader?
Is that Foxworthy?
So, want you to think for just a minute before you start to talk with a partner. Jot down anything else that you heard that you want to make sure you're having a conversation about. And then just real quickly, think about what kinds of discourse you might have heard. Was it a procedure fact, was it a justification, or was it a generalization? And I want you to look at your own data real quick before you share.
Can I ask you a question? Is this gonna be one of those where it's a matter of interpretation and we get, it can be either one of them, depending on what we say? Or how
Depends on what we
it?
say, but I'm going to press you for why you think it would. Why you think it is what you think
See
it
what you're
is.
looking for.
Yeah. So,
It also kind of depends on how they're taught. If that's the way they're all taught with those, then that's really just a procedure because they're continuing to get attention, right?
Context.
They're justifying or repeating
But still think she took it to a generalization because she applied it to
At the
every-
very end, when she said her final statement, like her close as she's erasing, she's
Yes.
generalizing the rule she just did, for sure.
so Rebecca, what do you think there was a generalization there?
The last thing she said.
Where she
I
said,
just
what did she
wrote
say?
at the end.
Works
was
in
her
every
statement.
odd number.
Okay.
Odds are evens are in pairs, and odds are pairs plus 1.
Okay.
Yeah, so she generalized the rule she was erasing, because she had already justified it by keep adding pairs to the end on the board. But what Dan was saying, which is that, was that something she just came up with, or was that something she was repeating from what the teacher just showed her? Because if that was the case, it would have been procedure. But if it was her own idea, then it would have been justifying fact. That's what, or justifying generalization. That's what you were trying to say, right? Yeah. So you have to know the whole context of the lesson, but from what we just saw is, I think, what you're asking us to put on there, right?
Right, and actually, if you flip the page over to 45, yeah, there's a transcript there. And again, the purpose in asking you to,
43?
oh, 43, sorry, am I off on the page number?
Yeah.
So the purpose in asking you to scribe some of the discourse as you were listening to the video is to get us into that practice of thinking really hard and practicing writing down what students are saying. Because you're not always going to have a transcript from your own classroom to refer back to. Or you might not have a transcript from the classroom that you're observing in. But there is a transcript on the next page over. So let's think about that. So when is something, and let's be specific about something in the transcript. When is it a procedure fact and when is it a generalization?
I think a procedure fact is when they can do it, and a generalization is when they can explain why.
In a different context.
Yeah. Or see how it is something else.
I think that's generalization, yeah. Apply it to
But it seemed to me that she started with justifying by showing her idea and then finished with the generalization.
Okay, so what about what she said, or where specifically in the transcript or the video, was it a justification?
When she was showing with the tick marks
On the board, right?
on the
Okay,
board,
so
how
what-
the odd numbers always have an extra.
Yeah. So when she was doing this and then adding one more, or if I come over
Right,
here.
that was the justification, showing why it was true.
Yeah, she said it has one extra and you could put any number of
Right.
pairs, and then she's added.
And when she said it works with every odd number.
So when she then said, because this is a pretty specific piece, she started to generalize when she said it works with any, Renee, what did you
With
say?
every odd number.
With every odd number, because we can add any number of these pairs on,
Yeah.
okay? Okay. But the wonder was, is that a procedure fact?
I'm sorry, repeat that.
So there was a question on the table about that statement, about it working with every one, and I think there was a few people that were wondering, was that a procedure fact rather than a generalization?
It says here, it doesn't show why, the procedure in fact doesn't show why it works. And she showed why it works.
Okay, so you're going back to the descriptions. Yeah. So at the top of the student discourse observation tool, looking at the descriptions of procedure facts, one of them says, explains ideas and methods.
Well, at the top of it, it says no evidence of reasoning. And so you're back to, had the teacher already taught it, and so she just worded it.
Yeah, so those top three bullets are underneath no evidence of reasoning. The next three bullets under procedure facts are under reasoning. So the explaining,
Explaining the idea and method, questioning,
Yep.
clarify.
but I think that's underneath, if that's in the bottom three bullets of procedure facts. So there is reasoning involved, being able to explain what they did, but maybe not necessarily why it
So
worked.
it sounds like the procedures is like a verbal, the justifying is more visual.
So justification definitely could be visual.
But yeah, show them.
I don't know that it always has to be, but it definitely could be, and then I think that's what she was doing here.
Right.
Yeah.
I wonder if this is just splitting hairs, and if what's more important is when are they repeating what they've been told, and when have they
Are they
made
coming
it their
up with
own?
their own ideas?
And it can be the very same statement,
Yep, absolutely.
you know?
Yep.
I think that we get a clue into that this is hers because it says they've been working independently to justify the conjecture, so it sounds like they've been just given some private think time before the teacher taught them. That's what it says in the narrator paragraph on page 42.
Couldn't you, for generalization, couldn't you use what the teacher said and come up with your own
Yes.
explanation? So like, if the teacher said, all right, we're gonna do this and we're gonna use the same thing, and she used 1 and 3, but the student came up and used a different set of numbers,
Or different representation.
yeah, wouldn't that be a generalization? Because she's
Could
not
be.
exactly, I mean, she's, even though the teacher explained how to do it, she's using a different set of numbers, so she's coming up with it.
And the way the problem was stated, that you're trying to create an argument for why the addition of two odd numbers is an even number implies that that's true. And then the kids are trying to justify why, and she goes into that generalization of saying it really does work with all odd numbers because I can add any number of pairs and I've got this one left over, and I think she does something like this. That shows that.
Can I ask a question about
Absolutely.
this? So, not being a math teacher, would the reason you'd want kids to know this be so they really understood the difference between an even and an odd number? Or would it be because it's a quick way for them to check if they're adding on their own, if their work is correct?
So purpose in a task like this, what would we want kids to know?
So I think, yes, to either of those. Why else might a teacher be talking about either this particular problem or a problem like this?
Well, you can use this for adults or upper level kids, to get them to practice demonstrating their thinking in a safe environment. If they're not used to saying, oh, I never thought about things like that, or whatnot, this is a good way to do it. A little simple thing that everyone can do.
Absolutely. So it could be
Patterns, finding patterns.
Absolutely. So it could be specific to the number sense that Dan just called out, or that you were mentioning, Ginger, in terms of having some understanding about odds and evens and what happens when we put them together. It could be about looking for patterns. It could be that you're giving kids an opportunity to dig into some mathematics, because what you're really pulling out here is, what am I looking for as the facilitator in a classroom when I'm asking kids to justify and generalize? Because then I can say to the kids, well, that generalization, did you hear Allison when she said yada, yada, yada? That was a generalization. That's something that we're thinking about in this classroom. Or when, when John shared this idea, that was a justification because he's showing why it would work in every situation. And so that's a justification. So it could be that you're doing it for a variety of purposes.
So I'm just trying to get my head around this. Like,
Yeah.
if you wanted them to practice generalizing or justifying, you could do it with the concept that they had to know.
Absolutely.
You wouldn't have to just pull one out.
Nope.
So I'm assuming that somewhere in the scope and sequence of K-12 and the Common Core that this is important. Is it tied to patterns? I mean, I'm just trying to place it somewhere, I guess.
Was this 4th grade?
This was 4th grade.
Right.
It was a few years ago, so I don't know that it's tied to the Common Core standards. I mean,
Saying
it's
is this
it's more of the
concept,
timing of it.
is the audit,
Pre-K.
is justifying this a Common Core standard? Is that?
Well, I'm just thinking, if you're trying to get them to use models or express their thinking, if it were me, I'd get, double bang for my buck
Absolutely.
and choose something they had to know. So I'm
Absolutely.
just trying to figure out, like, where this is situated in the whole,
Yes.
like,
So
bigger
if-
ideas.
If this was the specific mathematics that you wanted to work on, we would want to find the grade level that this was specific to, given our new standards. And
I'm just saying, is it in there? I guess that's what I,
So, this is not exactly this, but quickly I was able to see in 4th grade, identify arithmetic patterns, including patterns in the addition table or multiplication table, and explain them using properties of operations. For example, observe that 4 times a number is always even, and explain why 4 times a number can be decomposed into 2 equal add-ins.
I think that's what I was looking for.
And that is, sorry, this is 3rd grade.
But I think, Ginger, what you're calling out is really important, that it's not about coming up with some task. It's about using the mathematics that kids need to be making sense of, given your trajectory through your grade level or wherever you are in your curriculum map or whatever it is that's driving that specific content. This was pulled, as an example for us as adults to think about in terms of what does it mean to justify, what does it mean to generalize, and to think about what it could look like or sound like with students, as well as an opportunity to think about what's that discourse that we're hearing and how are we using that to think about what the student's understanding and or engaging in the mathematical habits. So my purpose in bringing this in was a little bit different in terms of wanting it to be a context for us to make sense of. But in the classroom, we would definitely want the mathematics to be whatever it is that you need to be working on with your students.
But at the
Because they
beginning
can
of the
be-
year, you could probably use this for just a simple problem to practice this kind of thing, right? I mean,
You could, but I think what Ginger is asking about is if you're gonna have kids working on these habits, which we
Right.
want you to do it around the mathematics that they need to make sense of so that you're not missing out on an opportunity to kind of double dip, where the content that you're working on is the math you want them to dig into, and you want them to do it that way, but maybe in a specific lesson, you really call out where they're justifying or generalizing.
I think it depends on your purpose. I think if you want them to really learn these things, you want to make sure the math is accessible to all kids. So you maybe use a concept that, such as this, that all kids are really clear on so that you can really reinforce, these things. I know that with the old ones, we had like a math habit of the week, and we would always try to emphasize that math habit initially through math content that was really easy for them because we wanted them to focus on learning the protocols.
which goes back to what we talked about yesterday. Are we teaching these, or like Ginger said, we want to integrate it into what the Common Core is for that grade level?
My input, and again, this is up to your district, but my input is that you're doing those while you're teaching the content you need to be teaching.
Exactly.
Because we want kids to do math that way, regardless of the math that you're working on. So if you're teaching 6th grade and your unit right now is about dividing fractions, that you're helping students learn about dividing fractions like that. If you're in 7th grade and you're working on proportional relationships, that you're working on proportional relationships in that way. If you're in high school and you're working on quadratic functions, that you're helping kids make sense of quadratic functions in that way. And it could be that to give them some of that access, like we started into quadratic functions and you really want kids to have access to that, and you're thinking about what are those connections to linear functions that they've just worked on. What's the same and what's different, because that can help them make sense of that new math by connecting it to, well, what's same and what's different. So we know there's some similarities, we know there's some differences. It's something they've just been working on. You guys need a break? Let's see, what time is it? 10:05. 10:15? Does that work? Okay.
How'd you find out about that?
Yeah, just by mistake.
I saw Ian leave, but I thought he went to like put a warmer in his coffee.
I was back there getting water and stuff.
Yeah. He's broke it out.
You were supposed to be watching.
I know. Oh, I guess I don't need to film the break.
That might be the interesting. I'll give you a couple to glance the article or check or circle the top for you that came out of the 2 minutes of private review and ideas, 3 in the article that you would want your colleagues in just a couple minutes. Chance to, kind of what I was saying, and think big ideas. Do something. I'm gonna read 1 and 3, 2 and 3, and we'll be. If you won, but if you are a 1, I'm gonna ask near Rebecca. Okay? So I'm gonna ask you to come over. Well, maybe that empty, kind of the spot right here by 3. I'm gonna ask you to corner. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. The groups are going to have 4 people, 3 people. Is to use a go-around protocol. Somebody start. I want you to learn your ideas. So some right here, and I've opted to go first. I'm going to share my 3. My partners aren't talking right. And then Rebecca shares her 3 ideas, and Steve shares his 3 ideas. Then, but I want to make sure that question until those ideas have come. Or saying something that you're, but I wanted to, before I flip the slide. You share those ideas together to come up with the article. I'm going to bring you, I've got pens up here that your poster, your 5 video or quad are coming up with. Lots of rattling off instructions. Okay, let's do it. I'll bring you paper. So 1, 2, 3.
Oh, no, that's okay.
You can just stay there.
That's 3 people, so if you were to come, it's all right. Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Just keeping out my nuts.
We were half
I
the
see
whole
that.
Are you go around protocol?
Sure. Oh, like actually the mathematical error how the students, but,
All right.
we're asking other students for. Really big thing that when I went to the, promote the challenge, I guess, preparing strategies, explain it. I agree with
Quality
this one.
student.
Consensus from.
Mathematical reasoning.
Yeah, you're always the right answer.
I guess highlighted we're both mathematical.
Since you moved, I think we should do the.
I said emphasize, one of them was that the emphasize reasoning more than.
Another one was the.
That we want that we want students to
As far as
understand
the,
procedures, and I thought the norms were interesting, supported by mathematical research, to engage further connections between strategies and both for the work. Those were the 4 norms for the classroom too.
Complete sentence.
No, I didn't.
Creating
No, I
classes.
just went back. I know one of my big ones was like giving facts, but actually.
Teacher having to include
I thought
these
that,
opportunities.
higher
So
the
that there's
price.
multiple. Okay, so I have.
That's what they're, I mean, pretty much that.
Thinking.
But
Probably
it's
want
the
to
same
there
thing that
multiple ways.
opportunities to.
I didn't mean different ways to get to
Social norms.
Accountability.
Oh,
That's alright.
explain strategies and so how you're setting, I think that was 4 things.
So we can put all that in
The
that.
press, that you're trying to get to hire the press. Then also,
Hey,
we observed that one teacher self-studying
Hold on.
problem solving. And I thought that was more, and you do that.
Join your group.
And
It's coming from over there.
to make sure distributed to.
Yeah, but you
They had to have.
I said, we could put you, oh, maybe.
Oh, they didn't like Flowhawk, I think.
Yeah, that wasn't the original.
The ones you already said.
Well, you got it over there.
So what do we got?
Bullets under one.
Do we need these late, is that appropriate?
I would say yes.
Yeah.
Quality.
Quality.
How you
Oh.
react to the state,
Oh,
either,
yeah.
yeah.
We also.
Have to do with math reasoning.
Mathematical relations also.
Yeah.
Math reasoning strategies.
Pretty sure we all said something about the, that's gonna be, for something watching the student.
Given up,
Right.
not just away with
Think
it.
about like response,
Yeah.
collaborative.
Collaborative work, individual accountability through mathematical.
Now you wanna hang those up so that the posters
No good marker?
You know, there's the,
Oh,
reasoning and subject strategy.
the one that's, I always resonate. A good teacher sometimes, but it doesn't really mean that. Engaging students in your head, you know, the whole notion, but it's really taking kids seriously. Taking students seriously.
Where this is-
Still looking value in, right? You know, in there.
I don't think so.
Yeah, that's. We won't judge them.
Where the boys are.
You know, having kids find whatever model they have, allowing them to use.
Yeah.
Well, that's one.
Such a long response, it didn't really, you know, it wasn't, how do response when there's a lot of mathematical sound. How the kids are thinking, they know it's not right, so they're done listening, because this doesn't make it. So finding it, heard and say.
Well, is it?
Talking about it.
And using mistakes in advance.
Usually it's okay, hold, let me interrupt for a second. I think you said
Yeah,
that.
they was,
He was the one calling me out.
don't worry about that eventually. But there's also the important thing of like giving kids a chance to think and handle that, because it's like.
Same that helps with that in journals.
Right.
And
And
then,
there's that, it's like, okay, then it's like, so, okay.
yeah.
Some kids are, but it's. I'm ready to post it out. We got our 5, yep.
Yeah, and I want to go back and artistic touch on
Just take just a couple more ideas and then we'll post in about 2. And if you're done with your poster, you explain your ideas to another.
English.
What about your ideas?
I want to see your reaction to dance.
You just had to open up the.
It's a loving, caring way.
No smile.
Just found that I really value. It is interesting though, when you're doing some of these, or you're being authentic, you second guess themselves, just because you immediately just ask them on mic. Goes back, that
Put them over here.
letting students, look, I'm gonna ask you questions.
And that way we would.
We have a
Yeah.
That's what Kimball did. Steps in with the step.
No.
No, she's got one.
No.
We're at 5, it's 2-4.
We're gonna do it now.
Contest, we
Oh, whichever one.
It was always, Jason got the shiny stuff.
That they've
Get
been.
everybody to come this direction, all 3 of them. Opportunity to get up and move.
That was a mathematic sound. She mentioned.
You're close enough that you can read it. I want you to take the list. Couple of things here. One, being across the 3 posters. Ideas are coming across it. And then second, what for one of the other groups. handling of
Mistakes.
mistakes? Mistakes is important. What's the art of mistakes?
The comment was that it's used as to open up discussion.
So how might we do that?
We can use questions, you see additive properties, multiplicative,
I think it goes back to what Renee said, is sometimes our entries are difficult, we're gonna make mistakes. And then where they're just, but starting out with a question that might be a little bit above those mistakes and we start to.
Especially if something, even mistakes really do start with something that kids are gonna feel bad and recognize. I mean, because when I make a mistake, I tend to learn a whole lot.
One thing you can do to kind of, as you're circulating a problem they take on ahead of time, you can just say, it's on somebody's paper and you put something about it, and, you know, one of the times you'll have a kid who, where the whole not mathematically sound, keeps going and going, and it kind of derails your being a little bit of a, try to, you know, make these.
Anticipated ahead of time and see that you're peeking over their shoulders. See kids making a specific, you write it up on the board or slide and ask kids, you know, what would you say to the student? Will the strategy work? Why not? I mean, you know, a variety of different questions, but it's a misconception when one student has it, that it supports their thinking.
To ask, tell me about, what was that? Did we all focus on the answer, or is it Jap? I don't even know. The process to work.
That was that answer given us.
That's what it was, yeah. So, kind of that.
We do want kids to have precision, process, and that understanding, work with the math, we're gonna generalize and be able to use, absolutely. What's another trend once? Collaboration, important. Okay, so. Why-
In different, youth.
Yeah.
I mean, and I did not get it, then
Because kids are gonna learn from me through the different strategies they're using.
they're learning as well, and they're improving it.
Absolutely.
To share and ask questions and publicly.
Comes back to set up your classroom, and do the kids feel in place to where they're comfortable asking questions and with a peer?
You just alluded to the social written on this poster?
Yeah.
Okay, so terms.
Just setting it up. The example we talk times in my question, and immediate answer's wrong, and an environment where students feel other questions, they answer a game where they're trying reading your body language, but you're promoting that environment. It truly is not just, and it goes to group work, assigning roles, making it not so at a time, even if you have to at least be able to tell groups then what the expectations are.
I started sensing for me this year, only one time that I'm gonna check, and that month. I said, other than that, we can't.
And sometimes things are not only a classroom, but it's the sixth graders, your team does the whole group. The kids will come to Michael's, establish other classes, so the kids talking to them. They're using words like that because they have the science stuff like that. So, as a article to have that whole.
So, what's up? You're thinking post and you're wondering, I wonder what they chose that.
Seems straightforward.
Yeah. I was wondering, talk about this, just go. Which group? Do you guys talk to us just a little beyond their initial observation, similarities and differences between? So that's a quote.
I just sprinkle them on, they're just to go on, and like that. So they're not penalty people, they know it's correct, and they went there.
I appreciate you guys sharing why you chose that quote, about the connections between them. That was one of my wonders about ensuring the classroom that we're seeking more as math in the classroom.
I have a question. How come the Big Five didn't mold it?
Ah.
Top was as an over control, and the three below under, these are quality systems.
Those three go under.
One was so, didn't deserve a circle.
I concur.
I asked a question about
And then kind of everything else. Okay, great. I'm gonna leave those thinking about this article we're pulling out. I'm gonna ask original seat for just a minute. If you would turn to page 40, and you have your notes, go ahead.
Pounder.
Page 48. to take a look at the two titled social norms, productive sociomath. Ask you to read down through and be thinking about how are these different, and I'll have you.
Fluency.
Partner, and just what you're thinking about related to these two columns, would encourage you then to add into your other productive stuff that you might be thinking about. Back up to the very top of it talks about have described social distinct from gender norms and that they are specifics of students' activity. You guys could be partners, and then partners, and you guys could be partners kind of around here, and partners. So check in with your partner about these two lists, socio-mathematical norms.
Explaining their different, but in the math class, what you call that, so it's not just like subtracted there, like beyond, yeah, exactly, for the next one.
But it'll make there, well, we just come up with the other one the first guy did.
About their why or about, we just wanna share that idea. Working together, individual and collective, you have like a task that you have as a group to that, so that to get in line with them.
So,
I didn't think it was
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, when they work with people for it, like what it's accountable for.
We had a score one again.
Everyone could be, or a simple pattern.
Not only have we
The biggest one here is
Within your
part of
group,
learning,
you
but
have-
it's not a, learn that. You're gonna have mistakes made, I'll celebrate that, but if you don't, make sure. Yeah.
And it's not, something like
Kind of like when you and yourself for lunch. Even though I taught that.
All right, back together. Just want to be kind of transparent. So you had a chance to read it, a chance to talk with a partner, conversations, and people to kind of start, and then we can move to ideas. So again, I need to get the conversation started with Kyle and ask him to share and make to Dan, Rebecca, and ask her to share what talking about.
Okay, so then I kind of came to talk about the social foundation, or the starting socio-mathematical norms, more some norms that in all classrooms, all norms are just specifically, I kind of added towards the end that social instinctual, just habit by nature, focus on teaching those to the student lead.
So from that, was some of the thinking about?
Sure, and I think what we noticed, the mathematical ones are specific, it's almost like there's the target. So if the norm target will to be success, example with maybe the goal in your lesson, how do you know that the state mathematical norms say that there's a lot of criteria in math. You take any subject, the socio-scientific would say the same thing. This is with collaboration, automatically making sure there's what I'm responsible for and I'm responsible for.
Add on to some of those.
I said Yackle and Cobb doing unnecessary work in quotations. You have the social norms, lengthy, with this and a little bit of, you don't want nations to be
Want them to be
commonsensical.
in how people are making
The first column, I would be as happy.
Are Yaffle and Cobb making it be, or is?
Well, see, English, you can take whatever, and for socio-mathematical, social physics, so you're just taking the social norm, trying to think of it in the context of it, as opposed to just.
Yeah, it's just with criteria in it.
Jim, we get those socio-mathematical. Yeah, you saw. Because one of those ideas that are in there about related to the mind and habits of interaction. We want that prepper, just like Rebecca and Steve, that we do need those social norms. The social norms are, and they're going to support being around those socio-mathematical. The way we might do that, press kids to think these to really engage kids. When you read down to the list, you didn't put what might be persevering. That is a social norm or both?
For a while, that's part of math, I mean, you look up through and you're working your way through.
Want them to hang in there.
I guess it would be they have to do it in other classes.
Yeah, to me, it's social norm. I mean, in English, it could be persevering through the rewrite. Science, it could be knowledge in your club. But again, it's the.
I think want kids to quit. Keep trying. Talk to them about specific ways. So if you get stuck, might you draw a partner? Might you check in with those specific ways that they within mathematics? Instead, it could be true. You could have social, like you called out. I mean, teachers are looking for. It might be very right here, but with a little want to have happen in a science class when they're digging in.
The science literacy, that whole book and the different literacies, what is the plan?
So, keep about half an hour before we think a little bit about, we're generating some ideas, or what could it look like on Wednesday. Wednesday, what might you do next semester? And Steve, that reminded us of the first day.
Yeah.
So I want us to spend, and being, what are you gonna go do with your students? When are you gonna do it by? So if you are, please, turn in your book. This is gonna be into the.
Ready for action? That's your
What did you put my name on it?
Page 58.
Grab my contact.
Full section 50. So I'm gonna ask you, thinking about those eight, and being about when you're gonna, this plan is for you. Being specific for yourself, hold accountable to try some of these things. Before we're done, our 4 days together related to those 4 next classrooms. This first, it goes with that first goal. Up there, where it says, is actually gonna be activity, sense making, reasoning. It's tied to what we looked at this morning, 5. It's the effective mathematics class. So that underneath there where it says the dates are, what are you going to do it by? Bottom section where it says document, essentially what do you look for, what could you give you evidence in those goals. Now I don't know if you will be, not you can ignore what happens right now is somebody, what kinds of things might we write that we might use? So I from some other action plan part of, or I know that teachers have written something in one of these examples. I mean, again, beg, borrow, steal. An idea and you think, oh man, if you see something that you might do, take the idea, look at something you're thinking, I would do. Don't feel strictly some examples that have come. Okay. Once they teach or work on a math September 30th, this is take a looks like, sounds like chart, give sentence frames to students when they post it used as a way to identify a habit and make a big deal. Post all the things come up, and something about being explicitly working on it. Ideas we have already come out. The person is thinking about how they're going to, and that BICE have done these things. And again, this was they're thinking about we did around listen and understand that we did frames that we mentioned. They're talking asking kids for evidence. Use them. If you don't, that's said. Justify and generalize the talk routine. And for a time for students to use a week. Remember that is high cognitive. They're going to go use the structuring, page 58 and 59. You want to write. Somebody said, coach or principal to have them tally math habits, and then reflect on that somebody into your classroom and just have which students are using these habits, etc. Reach math habits to explicitly plan book. They were going to write in their plan book. They're really working connections. So this is for some of the evidence. Sounds like chart. So part of it will be taking a picture of the chart out. They said, and then ask a principal or coach to collect structuring of student talk, review that data, make it. Use them. Math, and they're going to do this. Anticipate more than one. So as they're doing this, and they're going to facilitate more than one way to do the math. Use the math representation piece that we used here to think about. Store that, so that again, or you need to refer back to it. It's like once a week. Representations, and do this before September 3rd. A piece of their account, they might talk with their principal and assume that means that they're going to. So if you like, you're more than welcome to in our conversations here. Something you would do, feel free to, you're going to make in order to have some interaction alive. Jot somebody else in the room that you want them, or you teach the same grade level, get up and move around and rearrange, have someone to collaborate with, to jot down what are you going to do.
Two on YouTube trainings.
Sure. Student talk. Yeah. Okay. Swim around if there's one that's.
I'll do 2 trainings.
Thing where you have the.
Bring student outcome, and compare what we've been doing.
Okay, there we go. I'm just saying this.
Maybe putting, put this one instead.
But they should know that.
Go back to, like, like, how would you grasp, you know, output, how would you input side?
Next gig.
You're still cold, we're good.
Okay.
I guess this one. I said this. Viewing for 2 days.
There you go.
Yeah, there we go.
There you go. That might be something we talk about. Yeah. Maybe how to.
Yeah. Are you on?
Better stuff more.
See what class is it?
So what would you do? And then slide down
Then you're on your. Okay. Yeah.
Quick show of hands if you need another finish writing.
Oh, yeah. I don't worry. Actually, I heard that one day was a room extra happy. That's the only reason why I was even back in eighth grade, I was kind of like, what are you? She's a, I think she had a low read, right? She is. And she's pulling B's and C's and C's. Yeah. Wow.
It's like at the beginning of the chapter, it's happened.
So is your last 3 year reeval was 3 years ago, or for a combination? Oh, okay. Well, what accommodations are there?
That's the book, what is the course
I don't know, it comes back for the first
She's senior.
right now.
Jump in here and pull us together.
Equations and algebra.
Oh, right.
I can grab everybody's attention. So again, I appreciate the fact that you've been thinking really hard about what you're gonna go back to your room and do. And I have the privilege of peeking over shoulders or eavesdropping on conversations. But I wanna give you a chance to share some of your ideas and get ideas from other people. So I'm gonna have us break into school groups here in just a moment and just have you move to 3 different parts of the room. So bring your action plan with you. And when you get to your